say, you're not supposed to say, like Yahweh.
Yes, yes.
So,
a name I know how to pronounce.
Unpronounceable.
Yes. Akiva over these years has expanded that series, Under the Wings of God, an attempt not only to remember, but to give dignity and presence to the many who were murdered in the Warsaw Ghetto and in extermination camps beyond the ghetto, years 1943, 1945. I have been with Akiva as he has drawn some. I've gone to his home and his studio to see this work develop. There is such courage and such care in the work that he does. For him to be present among us today is a great blessing. I encourage you now, stay as much as you're able, please, for the sharing following this morning's worship, when he will show us further some of that work. Akiva Segan, welcome among us.
Thanks. So that will be a PowerPoint from starting at 12:15 for an hour. That will include question and answer time, and I understand people will be brown bagging lunch. I'll also be doing that myself. Is this the time I'm doing my talk? Thanks. Lest I forget, I want to mention the two artworks here I just brought this morning with assistance to my companion, Aura. That's Victor Hara on your right, a drawing I did just 2 years ago. In 2003, I began a companion series depicting victims of there are 16 works done now depicting victims of hate crimes, human rights atrocities since the late 1970s. And one drawing I did last year, pre-World War II, depicting an African-American young man who was lynched in Fort Lauderdale in 1935. The drawing on your left with the blue paper is of Gidel Lasky, and I'll just mention this now because it's not going to be shown in the PowerPoint presentation. In 1994, Brooke accompanied me to Seward Park to meet and visit Seattle's only Warsaw Ghetto survivor, Hannah Lauber, who died last month. And we brought a reporter from the UW Daily who wrote a very big story. Hannah Lauber had been asked to be interviewed over many years, always turned down interview requests, but agreed when I phoned her to have me bring a reporter because she said she was tired of hearing about Holocaust deniers. We spent about an hour, hour and a half. We all sat down on couches and chairs in her living room, and she just poured out this astonishing and wrenching story of what happened to her as a teen in the Warsaw Ghetto. And she had an aunt who had moved to Seattle in 1928 or 29. And Hannah and her father, one sister, and Gidel, who was about 5 or 6 at the time, were captured during the time of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising and liquidation in April 1943. They were sent off to a death camp called Majdanek in Poland. Hannah's father was shot on arrival when he asked an officer a question. She saw Gidel once, and she said Gidel was crying, and she knew she was going to die, and said she didn't want to die. And Gidel was gassed sometime after. And Gidel's mother, Hannah's sister, then decided she didn't want to live and went to the gas chamber lines voluntarily. And Hannah was then alone. Sometime after that, she was taken out of Majdanek and sent to Auschwitz, the most famous of or infamous of the Nazi concentration, slave labor, death camp complexes. Astonishingly, there, she finds it's a huge, it was like a city. I visited the camp ruins twice in the mid-1980s. It was like having, I don't know, 20 football fields and stadiums, everything, kind of all these enormous buildings and remnants of buildings and all that. She finds the sister who had been taken out of the ghetto a year earlier in 1941. The two of them are still alive when the Nazis closed the camp in 1944 as the Russian army is advancing from the east into eastern Poland. They both survived this death march into Germany, and they both survived the last year or so of the war as slave laborers in a munitions factory in a city called Malchow, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, in Germany. They were in a displaced persons camp after the war, and came to Seattle, both sisters, because they had this aunt who lived in Seattle, and they got visas from the Red Cross. I had actually met Hannah and her husband once. I didn't introduce myself in the 1980s. They had an army, I don't know, like a kind of outdoor wear tire shop in the lower arcade of one of the buildings in the Pike Market. And I remember seeing a tattoo on the forearm. It would have been Hannah. Her husband, who she met after the war, had been a partisan, Jewish. And Hannah was, she lost all her family, aside from this one sister, but she, in her years that I knew her, and I hadn't seen her in some years, she was happy because life had continued on. She had a daughter, or her daughter lives in Bellevue, and has a granddaughter who last year was in college. So, and the reason she had this photo, the aunt in Seattle had corresponded with all the family in Warsaw until the Nazi invasion in 1939. And the family in Warsaw had sent photographs to Seattle. So Hannah had this photo of Giedel when Giedel was a baby. That's the story. Now, onto my regular talk. I've added an extra 5 minutes, so I'm back up to the 15 you said I had the maximum time for, because I used I talked to 10. It started out at 20. So I'd like to extend my thanks first to Reverend Manny for the invite and the opportunity to engage in interfaith dialogue and education with your congregational community, and to any of the visitors here today. And to Reverend, and some of this has already been said by Brooke, who is, as of next month, I'll have been friends with for 20 years, and it's a strong friendship. For some years I've addressed Brooke as your Grace, which causes him to chuckle. He's laughing away now, especially when someone else is within earshot. Now I have a whole bunch of people that are within earshot. It's great. And while his Grace is Protestant and not a Catholic, less savingly to have him to kiss his ring, and I did see he's wearing one. He is, however, singularly unique, and I think he may qualify as an actual holy relic. He's shaking his head this way and laughing at the same time. It's great. 9 years ago, I was at work at my then job as a circ desk staff at the Seattle Public Library. I worked there for 29 years, supporting my art career. And a coworker, my age, and I were chatting one day about the Vietnam War and the Vietnam War years. And a young coworker who was around 23 at the time was like listening really avidly and attentively. And then he finally explained, "God, I love listening to you guys. You're like walking antiques." I've never let him forget it. Now that he's over the hill, he's at like 34. And so there you have it, holy relics and walking antiques. I also feel a personal connection with this church and your congregational community, as I was friends with someone named Bill Sessions back in the 1980s. We were neighbors and lived in the same building for several years. Bill was super enthusiastic about some of my art. He was especially fond of a portrait etching I had done of John Brown of Harper's Ferry, the abolitionist. And I wish Bill had lived long enough to have seen at least some of the first Under the Wings of God drawings. He died of an aneurysm in his apartment in First Hill in 1989, and I had begun the series 2 years later. He was raised Mormon in California and spent some of his growing up years in Argentina, because his parents were proselytizing Indians and others to the Mormon faith. Bill became Spanish fluent and volunteered here at this church as a translator with sanctuary refugees in the 1980s. And I offer my thanks to members past and present for your good work in helping save lives. It's a good thing it's not Yom Kippur, because you're not supposed to drink or eat. And I should mention, Reverend, about what you said about, apologizing or whatever. Jesus was, I don't know if any of you know the term MOT? It's American Jewish slang. American Jews will ask each other. You meet somebody you think they're Jewish, you say, "You an MOT?" It's short for member of the tribe. It's like American English slang for being Jewish. Jesus was an MOT. Now, a lot of Christians and a lot of Jews don't want to know this, but he really was.
Indeed.
The attacks and violence many Christians have engaged in towards Jews over 2,000 years of history has to do with the refusal of Jews to accept Jesus as the Messiah. This challenging and contentious subject is one among many topics I've been involved with over the last 20 years, during which time, as you've heard, I took on the creation of this large art series on the Holocaust Undoings of God, which most of whose depictions are of real people, individuals, mainly Jewish, but I've also, since 1999, I've done depictions of Christians who were persecuted by the Nazis and fascists, or people of Christian background, and I also did one Romani, gypsy child. Gypsies were also, like Jews, targeted and hunted down like animals across Europe, and 500,000 of them were murdered. But engaging in interfaith discussion and dialogue on fractious issues of Christian-Jewish relations and or regarding other conflicts, such as what we have today in the world, look at how Islam is viewed with great suspicion by many Christians and by many Jews as well, are not easy tasks. But they're indisputably important. It is only through dialogue and negotiation that we can learn to live with each other. Around 2004, Brooke accompanied me to a program I was invited to teach with the youngest age audience I'd yet taught with, and also since then has been the youngest age audience. It was 5 to 7-year-old kids, mainly African American, but not entirely, at Mount Zion Baptist Church in the Central District. The kids were great. One of them asked me a question that so startled me I was left completely speechless. And I was so startled I don't exactly remember what the question was. So in the series, as I mentioned, like with Giedel, I do these drawings from photographs of real people, and on most of the drawings I draw birds' wings, drawn from actual birds' wings, right down the street at the Burke Museum here, using ornithology collections. And this one boy, who's like 5 or 6, asked me during the question and answer something like this: if the person died, if the people died in your drawings, and you've drawn birds' wings, does this mean that the bird also died? And I was, as I say, I was so startled I didn't know what to say. I think I stood there for a long 10, 20 seconds. And I don't remember my response until I babbled out something eventually. I have no idea if it made any sense at all. And I do recall telling Brooke afterwards that I thought I had babbled something that the kid probably didn't have a clue about. But I like to think that maybe my energy, if haltingly stated in my response, meant something to him, and the energy of the artworks. It brings to mind the story about Elie Wiesel, who I think it was a guiding light for me personally in the years since I took up guest teaching. Wiesel had presented lectures at Notre Dame University in Indiana, and I read that he would talk about subjects that nobody in the audience was familiar with, such as Jewish communities and their debates in 18th, 17th century Poland, Lithuania, Russia, Hasidism, the rise of the Hasidic dynasties, the clash between the Hasidic style and the traditional rabbis of worship. And back then there were no secular Jews. If you lapsed out of observant Judaism, you became a Christian. There was no liberal denominations or anything. But I read that Wiesel spoke with such eloquence, enthusiasm, and in such an engaging way that everybody was moved, even if they hadn't a clue what he was talking about, which I find fascinating. So, now I likely read this in a book I have called Elie Wiesel, called Harry James Cargus and Elie Wiesel in Conversation. It was published by Paulus Press in 1975. And the book is done in interview format. Cargus asked the questions and Wiesel responded. And in response to a question by Cargus as to whether Christians and Jews can find common ground, Wiesel said, "I think Jews must say first certain words which hurt Christians. That Auschwitz would not have been possible without Christianity. The fact that Hitler was never excommunicated. That over 20% of the SS killers were practicing Christians. The fact that Pius XII never spoke up means that Christianity's role, or the Christian Church's role, both Protestant and Catholic, was so dominant in the fact that so many Jews could have been killed. All that has to be said. And he continues, once this has been articulated, I think there can be a meeting ground, provided one does not try to convert the other. Conversion is not a solution. If the Christians give up their dream to convert Israel, and in parentheses, Israel never tried to convert the church, then I'm sure we can find common ground. End of quote. I will add to that, in our ever continually conflict-ridden world, finding common ground as a means to achieving conflict resolution is as critically needed as ever. And while I don't believe that pain caused by war is relative, for example, some people say the Holocaust was worse than other genocides. I don't believe that pain and suffering should be viewed as one being worse than another. Pain and human suffering and pain and human suffering. But that there are so many wars continuing on today which don't need to happen is incomprehensible to me. And they're fueled by governments, including ours, and corporations which supply the armaments used in fighting. And many of the armaments go to countries, as you all know, it's a liberal congregation, which could so much use the millions spent on buying arms for health and schools and water and all that.
That's right.
And most of today's conflicts, the victims of most of today's conflicts are children, which makes the moral imperative of conflict resolution and dialogue all the more imperative to me. Victims of the Nazis included my mother's grandmother, whose name was Lada Barshevsky, who I only learned of on visiting a cousin of my mother's in Tel Aviv back in 1999, two of my mom's uncles and aunts by marriage, and two first cousins she never knew. And as long ago, or as recently as I like to think the Holocaust it's both recent and ancient history, at least for today's students. It's recent for us, ancient history for school kids, even college kids. I like to think that the Holocaust is not just a challenge to learn about, but is one not to be ignored, as it offers useful lessons for conflict resolution and with the ideal hope of preventing future genocides. And I can't put myself in the mind of a Christian, since I'm not a Christian, but I feel as if this response by Kargas, in addition to another response by Kargas' meeting, the sincere Christian knows that what died at Auschwitz was not the Jewish people, but Christianity, which raises to me a whole kind of big philosophical question regarding silence. And silence versus speaking out is the most important lesson I offer any group, especially when I'm in schools. When Don McKenzie, the retired senior minister at University Congregational Church, visited my studio recently, he said he thinks today's Christians are aware of the Holocaust and are sympathetic to it, but they have very little knowledge and or understanding of what it was in human terms, which I thought interesting. And what I see myself as a moral and ethical crisis of Christianity, and my apologies for delving into your turf here, regarding the Holocaust, didn't actually begin with the final solution to the Jewish problem, which is the Nazis, the mass plan to exterminate, murder all of Europe's Jews. It began a few years earlier in the 1930s. They systematically removed 500,000 Protestant and Catholic people who were disabled and institutions throughout Germany and Austria, and they murdered them. They gassed them, mainly in these like mobile trucks. And it took thousands and thousands of people to murder. It wasn't just Hitler. A lot of people say, oh, it's just Hitler. Hitler in the war against the Jews. It took millions of people to bring about this type of enormous genocide. And had, among the thousands of people who included clergy and people who were professionals, doctors, engineers, truck drivers, all walks of life, had people spoken out forcefully, diligently, and loudly, it's entirely possible not only that that might have been stopped, but that the Holocaust that followed, the war against the Jews, might not have happened. So the larger crisis for me, in looking at this history and in looking at what goes on in the world today, what's going to go on next year and the year after that, is what do we know? And now that we do know, let's say we hear about another Cambodia, Rwanda, Kosovo, what can we do? And knowing what can we do, what will we do? And silence should never be an option. So I'm reiterating here that the most important lesson I offer is the same one I tell students in schools. Don't be silent if you hear of injustice. And this is a great community of telling the to, because you're all proactive and sympathetic to all these things anyway. But if you hear of an injustice in your community or further away, don't be silent, speaking out. We all face choices in the course of our lives. During the time of the Holocaust, millions of people had choices. Everybody had a choice in Europe. The perpetrators, the murderers, those who assisted them, and those who assisted them by being silent. Even the victims faced choices, sometimes horrible ones. And look at what happened in one town in France as a remarkable example of what could have been and should have happened throughout Europe. In the Protestant village of Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, the townspeople saved as many Jews, about 3,000 as there were townspeople. And they did this at risk to the lives of everybody in the town. And if that seems a stretch, keep in mind that elsewhere in Nazi-occupied Europe, it happened in Czechoslovakia, there were retaliation attacks against partisans who attacked Nazi soldiers, armaments. A high-ranking Nazi officer was murdered in Czechoslovakia, and they would annihilate entire village populations. After the war, an old villager in this town in France said, "We didn't protect the Jews because we were moral or heroic people. We helped them because it was the human thing to do."
Mm-hmm.
One more paragraph. Again, I'd like to thank you and your congregational community for years of, in Hebrew, tikkun olam. It means healing the world. And another Hebrew word, tzedakah, doing good deeds. In saying that, I encourage myself also to keep at it, especially as I get older and I'm a walking antique now. And it's, it might be easier just to go ahead and garden and stuff, but I do want to keep proactive and teaching and so on. And most of my friends are of the same mind, and people like Brooke among them. And we try to consciously keep our eyes open, to not close our eyes to what's going on locally and worldwide, and to speak out. Shalom, salam, peace. Thank you.
Indeed. Thank you.